This is Chapter 19 of Give Me Liberty, An American History by Eric Foner. Safe for Democracy, the United States and World War I, 1916 to 1920. In 1902, W.T. Stead published a short volume with the arresting title, The Americanization of the World, or The Trend of the 20th Century, in which he predicted that the United States would soon emerge as the greatest of world powers. But what was most striking about his work was that Stead located the source of American power less in the realm of military might or territorial acquisition than in the country's single-minded commitment to the pursuit of wealth and the relentless international spread of American culture, art, music, journalism, even ideas about religion and gender relations. He foresaw a future in which the United States promoted its interests and values through an unending involvement in the affairs of other nations. Stead proved to be an accurate prophet. The Spanish-American War had established the United States as an international empire. Despite the conquest of the Philippines and Puerto Rico, however, the country's overseas holdings remained tiny compared to those of Britain, France, and Germany, and no more were added except for a strip of land surrounding the Panama Canal acquired in 1903 and the Virgin Islands purchased from Denmark in 1917. In 1900, Great Britain ruled over more than 300 million people in possessions scattered across the globe. And France had nearly 50 million subjects in Asia and Africa. Compared with these, the American presence in the world seemed very small. As Stead suggested, America's empire differed significantly from those of European countries. It was economic, cultural, and intellectual rather than territorial. The world's economy at the dawn of the 20th century was already highly globalized. An ever-increasing stream of goods, investments, and people flowed from country to country. Although Britain still dominated world banking and the British pound remained the major currency of international trade, the United States had become the leading industrial power. By 1914, it produced more than one-third of the world's manufactured goods. Spearheads of American culture, like movies and popular music, were not far behind. Europeans were fascinated by American ingenuity and mass production techniques. Many feared American products and culture would overwhelm their own. What are the chief new features of London life? One British writer asked in 1901. Europeans were fascinated by American ingenuity and mass production techniques. Many feared American products and culture would overwhelm their own. What are the chief new features of London life? One British writer asked in 1901. They are the telephone, the portable camera, the phonograph, the electric streetcar, the automobile, and the typewriter. In every one of these, the American maker is supreme. America's burgeoning connections with the outside world led to increasing military and political involvement. In the 2 decades after 1900, many of the basic principles that would guide American foreign policy for the rest of the century were formulated. The open door, the free flow of trade, investment, information, and culture, emerged as a key principle of American foreign relations. Americans in the 20th century often discuss foreign policy in the language of freedom, a supreme faith in America's historic destiny and the righteousness of its ideals enabled the country's leaders to think of the United States simultaneously as an emerging great power and as the worldwide embodiment of freedom. More than any other individual, Woodrow Wilson articulated this vision of America's relationship to the rest of the world. His foreign policy, called by historians liberal internationalism, rested on the conviction that economic and political progress went hand in hand. Thus, greater worldwide freedom would follow inevitably from increased American investment and trade abroad. Frequently during the 20th century, this conviction would serve as a mask for American power and self-interest. It would also inspire sincere efforts to bring freedom to other peoples. In either case, liberal internationalism represented a shift from the 19th century tradition of promoting freedom primarily by example to active intervention to remake the world in the American image. An era of intervention. Just as they expanded the powers of the federal government in domestic affairs, the progressive presidents were not reluctant to project American power outside the country's borders. At first, they refined their intervention to the Western Hemisphere, whose affairs the United States had claimed a special right to oversee ever since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. Between 1901 and 1920, U.S. Marines landed in Caribbean countries more than 20 times. Usually, they were dispatched to create a welcoming economic environment for American companies that wanted stable access to raw materials like bananas and sugar, and for bankers nervous that their loans to local governments might not be repaid. I took the Canal Zone. Theodore Roosevelt became far more active in international diplomacy than most of his predecessors, helping, for example, to negotiate a settlement of the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, a feat for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Closer to home, his policies were more aggressive. "I've always been fond of the West African proverb," he wrote, "speak softly and carry a big stick." The idea of a canal across the 41-mile-wide Isthmus of Panama had a long history. A longtime proponent of American naval development, Roosevelt was convinced that a canal would facilitate the movement of naval and commercial vessels between the two oceans. In 1903, when Colombia, of which Panama was a part, refused to cede land for the project, Roosevelt helped to set in motion an uprising by Panamanian conspirators. An American gunboat prevented the Colombian army from suppressing the rebellion. An American gunboat prevented the Colombian army from suppressing the rebellion. On establishing its independence, Panama signed a treaty giving the United States both the right to construct and operate a canal and sovereignty over the Panama Canal Zone, a 10-mile-wide strip of land through which the route would run. A remarkable feat of engineering, the canal was the largest construction project in American history to that date. Like the building of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s and much construction work today, it involved the widespread use of immigration labor. Most of the 60,000 workers came from the Caribbean islands of Barbados and Jamaica, but others hailed from Europe, Asia, and the United States. When completed in 1914, the canal reduced the sea voyage between the east and west coasts of the United States by 8,000 miles. "I took the Canal Zone," Roosevelt exulted, but the manner in which the canal had been initiated and the continued American rule over the Canal Zone would long remain a source of tension. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter, as a symbol of a new non-interventionist U.S. attitude toward Latin America, negotiated treaties that led to turning over the canal's operations and control of the Canal Zone to Panama in the year 2000. The Roosevelt Corollary. Roosevelt's actions in Panama anticipated the full-fledged implementation of a principle that came to be called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This held that the United States had the right to exercise an international power in the Western Hemisphere, a significant expansion of James Monroe's pledge to defend the hemisphere against European intervention. In 1904, Roosevelt ordered American forces to seize the custom houses of the Dominican Republic to ensure payment of that country's debts to European and American investors. In 1906, he dispatched troops to Cuba to oversee a disputed election. They remained in the country until 1909. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, landed Marines in Nicaragua to protect a government friendly to American economic interest. In general, however, Taft emphasized economic investment and loans from American banks rather than direct military intervention as the best way to spread American influence. As a result, his foreign policy became known as dollar diplomacy. Moral imperialism. The son of a Presbyterian minister, Woodrow Wilson brought to the presidency a missionary zeal and sense of his own and the nation's moral righteousness. He appointed as his Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, a strong anti-imperialist. Wilson promised a new foreign policy that would respect Latin America's independence and free it from foreign economic domination. But Wilson could not abandon the conviction that the United States had a responsibility to teach other peoples the lessons of democracy. Wilson's moral imperialism produced more military inventions in Latin America than any president before or since. In 1915, he sent Marines to occupy Haiti after the government refused to allow American banks to oversee its financial dealings. In 1916, he established a military government in the Dominican Republic, with the United States controlling the country's customs collections and paying its debts. American soldiers remained in the Dominican Republic until 1924 and in Haiti until 1934. Wilson's foreign policy underscored a paradox of modern American history. The presidents who spoke the most about freedom were more likely to intervene most frequently in the affairs of other countries. Wilson and Mexico. Wilson's major preoccupation in Latin America was Mexico, where in 1911 a revolution led by Francisco Madero overthrew the government of dictator Porfirio Diaz. 2 years later, without Wilson's knowledge, but with the backing of the U.S. ambassador and of American companies that controlled Mexico's oil and mining industries, military commander Victoriano Huerta assassinated Madero and seized power. Wilson was appalled. He would teach Latin Americans, he added, to elect good men. When civil war broke out in Mexico, Wilson ordered American troops to land at Veracruz to prevent the arrival of weapons meant for Huerta's forces. But to Wilson's surprise, Mexicans greeted the Marines as invaders rather than liberators. Huerta resigned in 1914 and fled the country. Meanwhile, various Mexican factions turned on one another. A peasant uprising in the southern part of the country, led by Emiliano Zapata, demanded land reform. The Wilson administration offered support to Venustiano Carranza, a leader more devoted to economic modernization. In 1916, several hundred men loyal to Francisco Pancho Villa, the leader of another peasant force, raided Columbus, New Mexico, a few miles north of the border, leading to the death of 17 Americans. With Carranza's approval, Wilson ordered 10,000 troops under the command of General John J. Pershing on an expedition into Mexico that unsuccessfully sought to arrest Villa. Chaos in Mexico continued within the next few years. Zapata, Carranza, and Villa all fell victim to assassination. Mexico was a warning that it might be difficult to use American might and to reorder the international affairs of other nations. America and the Great War. In June 1914, a Siberian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in Sarajevo. This deed set in motion a chain of events that plunged Europe into the most devastating war the world had ever seen. In the years before 1914, European nations had engaged in a scramble to obtain colonial possessions and had constructed a series of alliances seeking military domination within Europe. Within a little more than a month, because of the European powers' interlocking military alliances, Britain, France, Russia, and Japan, the Allies, found themselves at war with the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, whose holdings include modern-day Turkey and much of the Middle East. German forces quickly overran Belgium and part of northern France. The war then settled into a prolonged stalemate, with bloody, indecisive battles succeeding one another. New military technologies, Submarines, airplanes, machine guns, tanks, and poison gas produced unprecedented slaughter. In one 5-month battle of Verdun in 1916, 600,000 French and German soldiers perished, nearly as many deaths as in the entire American Civil War. By the time the war ended, an estimated 10 million soldiers and uncounted millions of civilians had perished. The Great War, or World War I, as it came to be called, dealt a severe blow to the optimism and self-confidence of Western civilization. For decades, philosophers, reformers, and politicians had hailed the triumph of reason and human progress, an outlook hard to reconcile with the mass slaughter of World War I. The conflict was also a shock to European socialists and labor movements. Karl Marx had called on the workers of the world to unite against their oppressors. Instead, they marched off to kill each other. Neutrality and preparedness. As war engulfed Europe, Americans found themselves sharply divided. British Americans sided with their nation of origin, as did many other Americans who associate Great Britain with liberty and democracy, and Germany with repressive government. On the other hand, German Americans identified with Germany, and Irish Americans bitterly opposed any aid to the British. Immigrants from the Russian Empire, especially Jews, had no desire to see the United States aid the Tsar's regime. When war broke out in 1914, President Wilson proclaimed American neutrality, but naval warfare in Europe reverberated in the United States. Naval warfare in Europe reverberated in the United States. Britain declared a naval blockade of Germany and began to stop American merchant vessels. Germany launched submarine warfare against ships entering and leaving British ports. In May 1915, a German submarine sank the British liner Lusitania, which was carrying a large cache of arms, off the coast of Ireland, causing the deaths of 1,198 passengers, including 124 Americans. Wilson composed a note of protest so strong that Bryan resigned as the Secretary of State, fearing that the president was laying the foundation for military intervention. The sinking of the Lusitania outraged American public opinion and strengthened the hands of those who believed the United States must prepare for possible entry into the war. Wilson himself had strong pro-British sympathies and viewed Germany as a natural foe of liberty. By the end of 1915, he embarked on a policy of preparedness, a crash program to expand the American Army and Navy. We're going to take a quick break.